In this pod-slice summary of the PBD Podcast featuring former CIA Covert Field Operations Officer Mike Barker, important points were raised about a sudden attack by Hamas and the failure of the intelligence community to predict such assault. Barker emphasized that the lapse seemed to resemble the failure of the U.S. intelligence community prior to the tragic events of 9/11. According to him, appreciable amounts of seemingly unrelated small data points of intelligence were accrued, but due to data compartmentalization across various agencies, the pieces were not assembled to reveal a clear picture of an impending attack. This underlines a recurring problem in intelligence gathering, which is the siloing of crucially discrete pieces of intelligence. Furthermore, Barker reiterated that gathering and understanding all data related to potential threats is a human endeavor that is subject to errors and oversights. Though agencies pick up small pieces here and there due to the complexity of the data and the situation, it's almost impossible to predict every potential threat. Also, Barker pointed out that the individuals behind such attacks normally maintain a very tight circle, keeping operations at a need-to-know level, which further complicates the intelligence community's ability to predict such attacks. Additionally, the problem is complicated by the vast underground tunnel system in Gaza used by Hamas to move undetected. The terrain is extremely difficult to monitor despite technology like ground-penetrating radar and surveillance capabilities. Part of the conversation was also on the fact that even when an attack is underway, the response time from the concerned authorities was not satisfactory, contributing to the escalation of such incidents. A key narrative that emerged from the conversation was the notion that Hamas is notably not driven by concerns about Palestinian casualties. According to Barker, Hamas understands that civilian casualties can shift international narratives, becoming a form of currency for them in the geopolitical space. This is why they would put civilians and their infrastructure at risk by embedding their stockpiles and military command centers within civilian locations. Such maneuverings, according to Barker, were deliberate and are strategically employed to exploit international sentiment when these areas are hit during counterattacks. Finally, Barker reminded that while civilian casualties are inevitably the result of retaliation attacks by Israel, the root cause remains the initial unprovoked attacks by Hamas. Thus, he argued, these civilians are the victims of Hamas as much as they are of any Israeli counteroffensive. The conversation, however, didn't venture into the dynamics of why Palestinians vote for Hamas, given that the strategies they employ arguably exacerbate civilian suffering. Amid the escalating clash between Hamas and Israeli forces, this portion of the conversation on the PBD Podcast with Mike Barker continued by involving their on-site friend residing in Israel named Jason Lyons. His first-hand experiences painted a picture of rising tensions in Jerusalem, which he likened to the calm before an intense hurricane. He forecasted an unprecedented incursion that the world has never seen before, orchestrated by the Israeli army. While there's an ongoing effort to mitigate collateral damage, it's inevitable due to the intricate web of Hamas-held hostages that includes many from foreign countries. Jason also shed light on the deplorable acts committed by Hamas, from the brutal kind of warfare practiced on Israelis to the supposed elections held at gunpoint, reinforcing the reality of their destructive character. Jason stressed the challenge of striking a balance for Israel, especially as Hamas continues to use Palestinians as human shields. This further complicates their military operations as there's a risk of collateral damage. Jason added that Israel, valuing life as much as any nation, will attempt to preserve civilians' lives despite this collateral damage's impending inevitability. The conversation also touched on the possibility of Egypt opening its borders to allow Palestinian refugees, negotiating with the Qataris on removing Hamas's leader from refuge there, and the security concerns about proposed acts of terrorism from the ex-head of Hamas. The dynamics also explored the distressing shift in perception of Israel as a safe haven, with people trying to get passports to flee rather than rush to it. Lastly, Jason emphasized the importance of remembering how this conflict started once it ends with the full might of the IDF. He worried that people might forget the initial trigger behind the dispute and only remember Israel's eventual military response, leading to a skewed perception. The podcast discussion took an analytical look at Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi, as he is referred to, as he is currently the longest-running prime minister in Israeli history. Notably, the conversation highlighted his unique political tenacity, referencing his ability to weather political ups and downs through a number of different administrations. Now, however, Netanyahu's leadership is being tested in unique ways due to ongoing military conflicts and court rulings. His handling of these situations has caused a few chinks in his armor, especially the potential detrimental impact on venture capital money flowing into Israel. While the thrust of the podcast discussion isn't to dissect if he's responsible for any offenses that have resulted in military conflict, it is acknowledged that as the CEO of the country, the responsibility ultimately rests with him. As Netanyahu's decisions and actions unfold, the speakers contemplate the future of Bibi's political career. Despite this, an interesting consensus surfaces that even in the face of political or military adversity, he tends to come out strong, drawing parallels with how America rallied around their leaders post the 9/11 attacks. The conversation underscores the idea that Netanyahu, being a war veteran himself and having lost family to war, commands a certain level of respect and support, especially during difficult times in Israel. The conversation then shifts to the conception of a unified national front between Israel and Hamas. They discuss the unlikelihood of such an outcome given the complex geopolitics and alliances at play. The complexity is further complicated by the veiled network and support behind Hamas, particularly from regimes like Iran. As the focus then moves to criticize the belief that one can destroy or annihilate a terrorist group like Hamas, the podcast draws attention to the fact that these are not simple zero-sum games. The speakers highlight that the problem isn't limited to individual groups, but rather is embedded deeply in the socio-political fabric of the countries in question. The conversation emphasizes the need to address the root of the problem rather than its manifestations. The conversation then returns to analyze Netanyahu's administration, with a general agreement that the prime minister may be able to maintain his political grip amidst the current conflict. As he himself stated, the winds can change very quickly in Israel, a testament to his formidable political skill. These are insights that strongly emerge in the podcast discussion, painting a comprehensive image of the Israeli political scenario amidst escalating tensions. The conversation dives further into the international implications of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a particular focus on the role of countries like the United States and Iran and how their policies shape the dynamics. The host, Patrick David Bett, highlights President Joe Biden's formidable warning to Iran and discusses the implications of renewed arms shipment to Israel from the U.S. following a Hamas attack. Also noted is Saudi's attempt to diplomatically maneuver through the escalating conflict, keen to maintain a relationship with both Israel and Palestine. The conversation evolves toward the complex web of interests involved in the Middle East. Mike Barker, the guest speaker, adds that the Saudi government would benefit from normalized relations with Israel due to economic development and stability. However, certain historical conflicts rooted deep within the region pose considerable challenges to such normalization. The situation with the United States is discussed with concerns about perceived inconsistency in U.S. policy, causing unease among regional allies. The soft approach towards Iran is noted as a cause of concern among allies like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. The speakers also touch upon the societal aspects of the situation, in particular, the significant issue of radicalization. The rise in the global Muslim population is emphasized, pointing to a growing influence of the Islamic world. Netting this number against radicalization statistics from various sources, they observe a substantial count of radicalized individuals that are rigidly set against Israel and could be potential threats. The conversation then steers towards future prospects post-conflict. They discuss how Hamas may not be quelled entirely despite potential retaliations and how the Israel-Palestine situation might persist or even escalate. To this point, they discuss the socio-political implications of Gaza's youthful and unemployed population, where Hamas fighters are perceived more as freedom fighters than terrorists. Consequently, they anticipate a residual effect where the ongoing conflict could breed further radicalism among the population, perpetuating the cycle of violence in the region. Further in the conversation, the podcast participants delve into the bleak reality of Gaza's economic conditions. They shine a light on its high unemployment rates, which in turn breed frustration and desperation. Bridging these complex societal issues with horror, Patrick David Bett offers an impactful hypothetical situation: a teenager whose father is killed right in front of him. This hypothetical narrative takes on powerful meaning in regions like Gaza, where violence is distressingly commonplace. The conversation progresses with the host and guests noting the popularity of revenge narratives in popular culture. They point out Hollywood's fascination with revenge-themed movies, underlining how this common element in all cultures can make it difficult to resolve conflicts peaceably without any lingering trace of resentment. The discussion leaves a stern warning. The conflict might never truly end unless the involved parties put effort into fundamentally altering their perspectives. Building on this, the conversation turns towards future possibilities. Patrick David Bett posits a solution which involves instilling fear in one's enemy to the point that they respect you, a tactic often executed by strong military leaders. However, he advocates that this is complemented by a diplomatic and respect-based approach to create a peaceful coexistence. There's a comparison to how some American states lead by strength, maintaining a strong military presence to enforce peace and order. In the wider context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the podcast participants turn their attention to the potential role of economic development in promoting peace. With the mention of countries like UAE and Kuwait, which have transformed themselves economically over the past few decades, they suggest that Gaza could follow that blueprint as well. They also discuss Israel's role in the blockade, which Palestinians often blame for their economic woes, presenting a nuance in the conversation centering on who's truly responsible for the conflict-ridden status quo. The discourse also indicates that it may be worthwhile for the United States to place closer attention to the growing threats, especially in relation to its borders. The panelists advocate for robust defensive strategies like setting up the Iron Dome systems at strategic locations across the nation to build a strong defense against potential threats. In the midst of these detailed discussions, the podcast participants remain aware of the emotional weight of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They remind us of the psychosocial effects that decades of violence, political instability, and economic deprivation can have on an individual's trajectory, hinting that it's not just a political issue, it's a human one too. The transcript of the conversation with Patrick David Bett, PDB, and guest Mike Barker channels into concerns over border security in the United States, referring to the possibility of criminals or extremists entering the country through unchecked immigration. The insecurity of the border becomes an issue when it becomes impossible to assess and respond effectively to potential threats. Barker argues for tighter border security, not to discourage immigration, but rather to have a controlled process wherein the United States can keep better tabs on who is entering the country. Additionally, Barker criticizes the idea of deploying military forces at the borders of the U.S., but he does strongly advocate for empowering existing organizations like Customs and Border Protection, CBP. These agencies, if adequately strengthened and supported, could more efficiently address and manage immigration and border security issues, Barker suggests. Conversation then heads towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the podcast participants discussing the provocation by Hamas and the Israeli response. They allude to the importance of specific historic and symbolic sites, such as the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which sits at the center of many controversies. Barker emphasizes the necessity for a sea change in how these conflicts are resolved, recognizing the cyclical, destructive pattern of violence, followed by a return to the status quo. Amid the deep discussion on international conflicts, PDB and Barker also mention that domestic political rhetoric in the U.S. can play a significant role in sparking or fueling mass migration. They criticize how campaign promises and critique of rival policies can cultivate a sense that the U.S. has an open immigration policy, inadvertently leading to a surge in migration. Finally, the geographical context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict receives attention, emphasizing the diminutive size of Israel compared to the surrounding Arab world. This puts into perspective the dynamics of land ownership, control, and conflict resolutions in the Middle East, reminding listeners of the complex layers involved. The podcast participants also reference past territorial shifts, such as the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt after the war, providing historical depth to the current conversation. In an interesting cycle of discussions, Patrick David Bett and guest Mike Barker delve into the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly considering the geographical and demographic dynamics. Mike Barker discusses the dense Jewish population in Israel, a small nation surrounded by the Arab world. He raises many provocative questions about what measures could be taken to resolve the protracted conflict. Instead of merely focusing on the size of the Jewish population inhabiting a small area in Israel, the host and guest brought into focus the humanitarian concerns in the Gaza Strip. They highlight an underlying irony about the Arab nations often voicing support for marginalized Palestinians, but paradoxically demonstrating resistance to integrate them into their own lands. The conversation then shifts between the lines of international conflicts and national politics in the United States, calling into focus the perceived instrumentalization of global crises like the Palestinian-Israel conflict by political figures to stay relevant in the American political discourse. The hosts critically evaluate former President Trump's post-presidency comments on international affairs. They consider potential political motives behind his remarks on Israel and argue that criticizing Netanyahu may be part of Trump's strategy to position himself better for possible future runs. The key emphasis is on the potential fallout of such individually focused approaches that could hamper multilateral relations and alliances. They also highlight contrasting leadership styles. By referencing the Four Agreements Wisdom Book, they indicate the significance of maintaining one's word as a fundamental principle of leadership. Concurrently, they discuss Trump's rather audacious approach to shut down the government, illustration of the varying perspectives on what constitutes effective leadership. The juxtaposition highlights a tension between respect for audacious leadership decisions and concerns about the fallout of temporally beneficial audaciousness. In a vibrant and iterative dialogue, Patrick David Bett and Mike Barker dig deep into the potency of how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and demographics play out on American politics. The Trump administration's approach turns into one of their key talking points. The hosts argue that comments post-presidency from Trump about Israel may be part of a strategic positioning for potential future runs. The conversation also shifts to the intricacies of government shutdowns. The hosts vividly recall a public spat between former President Trump and Senator Chuck Schumer over border wall funding, which led to a government shutdown. The discussion then takes an intriguing turn towards voter dynamics and the motivations behind casting votes. The hosts ponder over the phenomena of buyer's remorse, questioning how many of the 81 million people that voted for Biden would flip their vote or sit out the next election. David Bett speculates a 5% shift could occur based on political climate and dissatisfaction with Biden's policies. Further into this, they explore a potential Trump re-election. David Bett firmly believes that Trump has a viable path back into office, unless a significant obstruction like a major domestic or global crisis intervenes. Barker unearths his uncertainty about Trump as a polarizing entity, suggesting the Democrats would instead prefer to face Trump, as he could cause the Republicans to scatter. However, an interesting point is brought up about the transactional nature of votes. Voters who initially are against Trump might eventually support him, purely from a party alignment perspective. This demonstrates the fluidity and often unpredictability in political allegiance, a theme that pervades American politics. Moreover, they delve into the possibility of Trump acting as an effective opponent, with a rich catalog of Democratic policy flip-flops since he left office, providing ample ammunition for Trump's campaign. This section of the podcast also discusses whether those who are vehemently anti-Trump, like the Lincoln Project, could potentially shift their stance whilst highlighting the fall of credibility that the Lincoln Project has experienced. Finally, they examine potential competing candidates within the Republican Party like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, whose potential influence on voters could impact Trump's chances. Yet they remain intrigued about how Trump's potential reemergence could impact American politics and the 2024 elections. As the discussion continues, a palpable anticipation hangs over the next 6 weeks, which David Bett hints would set the stage for how politics unfold. David Bett suggests that observers fall into two groups, one that sees the return of a potential establishment regime, and the other fearfully predicting catastrophe. Regardless, it's clear that the hosts believe the coming period will be impactful and nothing short of show craziness. Mike Barker chimes in on this aspect, emphasizing the level of uncertainty and turbulence ahead. Both hosts elicit a sense of urgency and change, subtly highlighting the tumultuousness of the forthcoming political landscape. Notably, the podcast takes a brief deviation from politics, as David Bett takes the opportunity to mention Barker's own show, The President's Daily Brief. This tangential yet vital point underscores the rapport between the hosts and the depth of their mutual respect, giving listeners a sense of the well-rounded knowledge each brings to the podcast. David Bett enthusiastically recommends Barker's podcast, available on Spotify, iTunes, and the First TV. He endorses it as an essential listen, highlighting the credibility and authenticity of Barker's show. Meanwhile, Barker's insights continue to shine through his contribution to the conversation. He brings a balance to the dialogue, often providing counterpoints to David Bett's speculations, rounding out the debate and adding dimension to the issues being discussed. Barker's predictions, while not always in alignment with David Betts, bring an important balance and enhance the complexity, depth, and richness of their conversation. Barker's opinions, similar to David Betts, mirror the intricate dance that many citizens navigate in the political sphere, ebbing and flowing, switching stances based on evolving perspectives and current events. This is a reminder of the continuously changing symphony of political allegiances, an omnipresent refrain in the podcast discussion. Analyzing these subtle shifts, the voices, opinions, and predictions of both hosts serve to create a comprehensive landscape of possibilities in American politics. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.